Ag Country offers a wide range of internal growth. If you have a goal in mind and you put your mind to it, your successes can be endless.
There are so many jobs within this company that you can rotate into.
I like challenges. Ag Country gives me challenges.
Yeah, Ag Country is a great place to work. There's plenty of flexibility. You're never tied to your desk. There's a team here that is always there for you.
Yeah, grab your role and run with it. And always be aware of the opportunities because they're in front of you.
Everybody, if you have been waiting on the edge of your seats in anticipation, you can imagine how we feel up here waiting for this to start. So I am Bobby Sondriel, and this is Amy Wagner. We're with Ag Country, and today we get to talk to you about building your legacy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how succession and retirement planning will be integrated with your tax plan. So Amy, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks. As Bobby said, I'm Amy Wagner. I've been with Ag Country in the tax department for just over 12 years. We pride ourselves on our focus on ag. We can help you with planning, preparation of your tax returns, any entity structures that you're looking at, we can help you make some decisions with that. We can help you take care of some tax consequences if you're selling a lot of assets or you have a lot of grain inventory. We can look at some different choices that we have with that. We've got a team of about 35 specialists with years of experience, so there's not a lot of situations that we haven't ever seen before. We work closely with the credit department, the S&R department, and other departments in Ag Country to make sure that we're making the best strategy for your operation and helping you reach your goals.
So I had already said I'm Bobby Sondriel. I work in our succession and retirement department. I've worked there for about 6 years, so I get to try to help people plan for generational success. So whether that's through an estate plan, transition planning, retirement planning, we need to work with your entities, some family meetings, whatever it is, I get to help with that piece. And we work really closely with the tax team because a lot of the things that we're talking about through that is going to affect your tax situation. So Amy and I get to work real closely together. She loves it, even if she tells you differently.
We've got a list of topics that we're going to cover today. We're going to take a look at some of the most tax-efficient ways to enter retirement. We're going to touch on some estate and succession planning, a few strategies we have for asset protection. What does retirement look like? What does it look like if you have a successor? The importance of communication, and then towards the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions if you have any.
So to help us today, we have a sample client, Farmer Joe, and we have his situation spelled out here to kind of walk us through the things that we would help a customer with if they came in and they were like Joe. Joe is 60 years old. His goal that he told me, he wants to retire sooner rather than later. So if I have any Joes in here, listen, we'll try to help you, okay? Joe is married to Jan. Jan does not work off the farm. They have 3 children, 2 of which are not farming and 1 of who wishes to be a successor in the farm. They farm around 2,000 acres. Joe farms as a sole proprietor right now, owns 800 acres and rents about 1,200. They have $1 million of machinery and equipment. They have about $500,000 in a grain storage system and a dryer, and then they have $400,000 worth of debt. So, Joe walks in, he wants to retire. Help us, Amy.
We know everybody loves to pay tax. So what are some ways that we can help Joe enter retirement and try to mitigate that tax situation and make sure that he's getting to keep some of that money in his pocket?
So what does this say? Tax-efficient retirement, not tax-free retirement.
Correct.
We are not miracle workers.
The first thing we're going to talk about is Joe's machinery and his buildings. Most farmers, ranchers have a pretty sizable line of equipment by the time they're ready for retirement. So the question arises, what are we going to do with all of it? As we mentioned, Joe has about $1 million in a line of equipment plus that grain storage system. There's a lot of money sitting out there. how do we get him out from owning all those? In his case, he has a successor plan, so that helps him a little bit, but there are a few options we have even if there isn't a successor. The first thing we've got listed on the screen here is piece by piece. Joe can choose to sell a couple pieces of equipment to his successor or to an outside party in the years leading up to the time that he's done. Another option that we often see is if the successor wants to buy a new piece of equipment, Joe would put in the trade, the successor pays the boot, and then owns that new piece of equipment. Remember, with either one of those sales will be taxable to you based upon how much you're selling those pieces for. Another choice we would have would be an operating lease. Joe could get with his successor and form an operating lease saying, okay, we're going to lease this equipment for 10 years. Those payments would be deductible to the successor, taxable to Joe, and then at the end, we would decide if there's a buyout or if we would do some gifting or what that looks like for their situation. One thing we always want to keep in mind is depreciation recapture. When you take depreciation on an asset through that asset's life and then you sell it, you need to recapture that depreciation that you've expensed in the form of ordinary income on your tax return. You might think, oh, if we do an installment sale, maybe a type of contract for deed, that might work good in this situation. That's a different deal than an operating lease, and with installment sales or contracts, all of that depreciation recapture that we just mentioned would be taxable to the retirer in the first year of that sale. So that's probably not a great option for Joe this year.
So we get through the machinery and buildings, and then we want to talk about the land. So usually the land is the last thing to transition for the retiree. They want to use that income for their retirement income. So what are we looking at? But if they did look to sell that, it has a different tax treatment than the machinery and equipment like Amy just talked about. So if land is sold, it's a different type of asset according to the IRS, and you can do a contract for deed, whereas you would pay a little tax with each payment. The difference between your basis, which is usually the price you paid for it, there might be some adjustments in there depending on what you've got going on with the land, but difference between the basis and the sale price will be taxed at a capital gain. So that is a different rate than your ordinary income rate. So if we start to transition that, we're considering the tax ramifications of that as well. Then, if we're not ready to sell it yet, we might look at leasing the land. So with Joe, he has some landlords that he needs to start introducing his son or daughter to. And then also with the lease, if he decided to do that on his machinery and equipment, and we tie it together with his owned land in one lease agreement, that lease payment would not be subject to self-employment tax. So we can start to save there because we turn it into passive income and not subject to self-employment tax.
Next up is crop inventory. We mentioned that Joe has about $1.5 million worth of crop inventory. He said he wanted to retire sooner than later, but if we sell all that grain this year, that's gonna look a little rough, I think, on his tax return. One of the options we have would be deferred payment contracts. This isn't only if you're looking at retirement. We often tell people to sell some grain on deferred contracts, whether you deliver it or take the money into the next year. If that contract is in place, we can pull that income into the prior tax year. It's a really nice tool to make sure that we're filling up those lower tax brackets or getting people to a certain spot that they're looking for in their tax return. Another choice would be a defined benefit pension plan. This is something you'd set up with your financial advisor. There's some rules around it and some parameters based on age, current interest rates, historical income information from your operation, and the financial planners kind of come up with a plan for you. It's typically a higher amount than you would typically put into a retirement plan like your normal IRAs. It's usually a minimum of a 3-year commitment to making those plans. But it's a great way to put some extra income away for further growth in the market and then also to be used for future. One thing we always want to think about when we're looking at getting rid of some inventory or getting close to retirement is prepaid expenses. Oftentimes, people will prepay quite a bit into the next year, and at some point, that has to come to an end. So if you decide today that you want to be done farming after harvest, and you've typically done a lot of prepays, it can definitely affect your tax return. So if we have that at the forefront of our mind and make a plan for it, we can start to wind down on how much prepaying we're actually doing, because at some point those expenses will go away.
So I think this might be a good point to also tell you to make sure your team of professionals, whether that's Amy, me, both of us, all of your team that helps you out, know your plan. Because you might go into Amy and say, I don't want to pay that much tax. Well, yeah, that's what you said the last 30 years. We get that. But you come to me and say, I want to retire sooner rather than later. Well, now I'm telling Amy, whoa, 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 you can't do the tax plan like that. We got to get Joe out. So you want to make sure everyone's on the same page and knows what your plan is. So once we get through those things, how are we going to transition the assets? We also want to make sure that Joe and Jan have enough in retirement. If you go home and tell Jan that you gave everything to your son or daughter and we don't have anything to live on or go travel, she's probably not going to be happy. So we want to make sure we have made a plan for that. Where is the income coming from? Is it land rent? Is it crop share? Are we getting income from the lease payments on the machinery or buildings? How are we going to take that grain in and pay as little tax as we can, make it tax efficient? Do we have wages and salary? No one currently works off the farm. Do we need to have some of that? Retirement plans, have we funded those? Have we started those early? Do we have that defined benefit pension plan that we can pull from if we need? Social Security, have we done an okay job paying tax, or are we surprised by what little our Social Security payment is monthly? That's going to help there. And then we need to make sure we understand what's going to service the debt. So lenders want to get paid, so we want to make sure we can service the debt and still make sure we can keep Jan happy and do some fun things in retirement, right?
This chart is in your packet as well. It's a little maybe hard to see up on the screens here. As you know, in 2026, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is pretty much the current tax law, will be sunsetting. I have this chart listing the rates that it would revert back to if nothing was done to change it. The brackets themselves have not been indexed for inflation. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but the rates would go back to these amounts. I just want to highlight the fact that in almost every bracket, the rate is higher and the bracket itself is narrower, meaning you're going to get into those higher brackets quicker. It's always important to know kind of what tax bracket you're at. As we mentioned before, those deferred contracts or some different tools that we have, making sure that we're taking advantage of some of the lower brackets, or making sure that we're getting the best tax plan in place to make sure that in those final years before you fully retire, we're not stuck only in those highest brackets.
And Amy might have said this, but I might have missed it. So this is at the end of 2025 is when we will revert back if Congress doesn't change anything with our tax rules. So with Joe, if he wants to retire sooner rather than later, maybe we need to be filling these up in the next couple of years, knowing what his plan is. Speaking of those changes, there are also some changes with the federal estate and gift tax limits that will also expire at the end of 2025. So right now, our current estate tax limit for an individual is $13,610,000. For a married couple, it's over $27 million because you get those two exemptions. So if your estate is below that and we die when those limits are in place, we don't owe any estate tax. If it is over that, we owe 40% federal estate tax. At the end of 2025, so starting in 2026, they revert back to those old rules. 2017, which was $5 million index for inflation, which we believe somewhere to be around $7.5 million. So it'll be basically cut in half. We'll have $15 million. So now if we have an estate over $15 million, we die, we might owe 40%. Oh, do we have the liquidity in our farm to pay the tax? How are we going to do that? We need to make sure we're planning using the tools that we can to try to maybe shrink the estate or transition assets now. We won't get too much into it, but the annual gift exemption, I get asked that a lot. How much can I give away? Well, you can give away $13,610,000 if you want, but your annual freebie is $18,000 in 2024. So everyone can give $18,000 to all of their friends, and you don't have to tell the IRS, and you can go along on your way.
Speaking of succession and retirement planning, a big part of that is also estate planning. We do have a lot of tools that we utilize to figure out your estate, and once you're retired, we need to make sure that these bases are covered as well. You want to talk a little bit about wills and estate plans, Bobby?
Sure, I'd love to. Joe and Jan thought they were done with me. We figured out a transition plan. We know what we're doing with our assets. Well, what happens if you aren't done with that yet? We want to make sure that your estate plan reflects what your transition plan says as well. We want to make sure your heirs understand what that plan is. So why do you need a will or a trust? This will determine how your assets are distributed after your death. If you don't have a will or a revocable living trust, the state will determine how that happens for you. If you guys trust our state governments to do that, go ahead, don't have to get one. But if you don't, come and see me, we'll figure it out, and we'll get a good plan in place. A will might spin off into a trust for kids, minor children, maybe kids who are irresponsible. Maybe we want a farmland trust, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. Younger generation, if we have minor children, we want to name someone to care for our children physically as a guardian, as well as financially, maybe as a trustee. We want to pick those people because we don't want someone else picking for us, so we want to have that documented in our plan. Just a little note too, wills go through the probate process, which is the legal process to settle your estate. It's a public process. You go to the judge, get approved to be the personal representative. You have to come back and get all of that approved. Revocable living trusts, if funded properly, can avoid probate. So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what might be the right solution for you. And then you don't get to stop there. You also should have some of these things in place. A durable power of attorney. So during lifetime, who will handle your financial affairs if you were unable to do that? Again, you want to pick that person who you think is right for the job, so we want you to have it written down in your durable power of attorney. If you become incapacitated, that would hold up and they would be able to continue your business. Very important with our farms. Healthcare directive, let's leave a written set of instructions for our family to try to ease the process of making a decision if we were terminally ill, and who would make that decision for us. The last couple of things, proper titling of assets and beneficiary designations. We want to make sure that all of that aligns with your overall plan. If we have, beneficiaries designated on an IRA that we said we're all going to non-farm children, and we left all 3 children in Joe's case on the IRA, they're going to get split between 3 of them, regardless of what your will says. So we want to make sure we have the asset titled properly and proper beneficiary designations that goes with your overall plan. So Joe and Jan, they're getting sick of me, but we're going to get this done, and I know at the end of the day they'll feel relieved that it's in writing.
Another consideration that we have to think about when we're looking at estate planning is, where do we reside, and also where do we own real estate? Oftentimes, when we are kind of on the border of 2 states, as many of us are here, sometimes that can flip into the next state, or you may own real estate in both states. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Minnesota are the states that we typically work with. Those first 3 don't have any specific or separate estate tax rules. They follow federal, they stay in line with them. Of course, Minnesota likes to play by their own set of rules, so they do things a little bit differently. Joe and Jan live in North Dakota, so it's so lucky for them. They are able to follow the federal rules and they don't have to have anything separate set aside. However, if Joe and Jan decide that, for example, they want to buy a lake cabin in Minnesota in their retirement years, that can have an effect, and depending upon what kind of lake cabin they have, it could have an effect on their need for a Minnesota estate tax return. Right now, Minnesota's estate tax exemption is $3 million per person. There is an additional $2 million that if certain parameters are met, qualified farmland, business assets, it can be added to that. There are some special considerations made for that and special rules surrounding that. Remember that in Minnesota, there's no portability between spouses, meaning that $3 million that everyone gets is individual. If one passes away and only uses part of it, the remainder of it doesn't go to the other spouse. They get their own $3 million and that's it. Right now, for estates that are over that $3 million exemption, the Minnesota rate ranges from 13 to 16%. And another thing to think about, if you are not a Minnesota resident, but you still own Minnesota real estate, even if you don't have to have a federal estate, or you don't have to have an estate in the state that you live in, you still may need a Minnesota estate tax return if that limit is met.
All right, Joe's back. Remember Joe. He's married to Jan. He's got his children. He's got a successor. Farms that acres. We have his transition plan for all those. We also added in his retirement account is about $1 million. He did a good job saving. Life insurance with a death benefit of $1 million, and then he has his house in town of $250,000. So what did Joe and Jan decide was appropriate for their estate plan? With the machinery, equipment, and grain handling system, they want this just given to the successor if it has not yet already been transitioned, or if it's in a lease, maybe he needs to complete the lease, but they said if it's not already transitioned, we want it to go to the successor farmer. Our farmland, we have 800 acres. They want 3/4 to go to the successor, and they want 1/4 to each of the other non-farming children. That's an emotional thing for them. They want to make sure everyone has some of that farmland, but they're also going to put some stipulations in place that if any of those non-farming children want to sell, the farmer would have the right to buy it at 50% of appraised value. When Amy and I were putting this together, I'm embarrassed to tell you how long it took me to try get an even number, and I didn't. So the buyout is $1,040,000 if both of his siblings elect to sell. We want to continue to update that to make sure we think that's a feasible buyout if that successor is farming those 2,000 acres and has to buy both of them out at one time. That is why they elected not to have a buyout on any of the machinery and equipment. That's gonna be enough that that's all he can bite off at that time. We feel like we treated the non-sibling or non-farmer children fairly because we're gonna let them have our retirement account if there's any left, and then our death benefit, so they'll each split that. So you can kind of see how that gets worked out for all of them. Now that's their definition of fair. That doesn't mean that's right for you, but that is what they determined and agreed upon, that this is the plan that they wanted documented. And I can tell you that their kids are at least gonna be happy they know what their parents wanted, and it's in writing.
So we've talked a little bit about estate planning. Bobby touched on those things. Another question that we often get asked when meeting with people and talking about some of these things is, how can I protect my assets and the things I have, my land, from the nursing home if I have to be placed into a facility?
Yep.
You have any tools for that?
Yeah, you can see it's an ongoing process. We get through one thing, we might want to start thinking about the next. So we have our will in place, and now we're getting older. We aren't sure about the nursing home. It makes us uneasy. We don't want to have all of our land have to be sold to pay for it. What are some tools that we can look at for asset protection strategies? So just briefly going over the rules, when if you enter a nursing home facility and you apply for medical assistance, so that's a state-run program, we call it Medicaid, then they want to understand what your assets are and what your income is, and if you can pay your own way or if you can't. If you're claiming that you can't pay your own way, they want you to prove it, and they have some limits associated with what you can still have and receive medical assistance. So you'll see that for this year, if you are a married individual, just over $154,000 worth of assets would be able to be kept by the non-institutionalized spouse, and $3,000 for the institutionalized spouse who would be applying for medical assistance. If you're a single person, it's $3,000. That's not gonna get you too far, especially if you have, in this situation, 5/4 of land. So people will maybe start to look at trying to get those assets out of their name. There's a look back period. So don't wait to plan because it's a 60-month look back period. So when you're trying to prove it, they want to know the last 60 months of financial transactions that you've done and whether or not any of those would disqualify you from receiving medical assistance. We might look at completely gifting an asset. Again, if we need the income from that, maybe not a choice, but we might look at doing that. Selling land on a contract for deed. If we lock that in, we want to sell it at a reasonable price. There might be a gift, and you need to file a gift tax return and make sure you're telling Amy or your tax specialist if you've done any of this. And then that payment would need to be used to pay for your care, but at least if you've passed that 5-year period when you've locked that in, we wouldn't have to consider that kind of discounted sale as a gift. Long-term care insurance, if you haven't already purchased it, you could explore that idea. They're very expensive, but they work, and if you have it, great. It usually just is a supplement to help pay your way. It's not going to usually take care of the whole bill just based on the price of care. You might use an irrevocable trust or a life estate. Those are the most common that people end up doing because they get to keep the rights to the income, but they're transferring the asset either into a trust for the benefit of maybe children or a life estate into their children's names. We have to take into consideration if we're transferring an asset, we're giving up control. Where are we putting it into? Is it a safe environment? Things that could happen in our kids' life. Again, 60 months, 5-year look back applies for that. So we need to make sure we're planning appropriately. Amy already told you, and not a surprise probably, Minnesota plays by their own rules. They have their own rules that they apply to life estates and irrevocable trusts as well. So I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, but basically your life interest is never protected, even after that 5 years, but the remainder interest may be if you do things correctly. So we've kind of gone full circle, but I cannot let you leave without actually telling you about the 2 most important things that I harp on everyone about, and that's communication and written documentation. So, Amy, take it home for us.
As Bobby said, communication is so important. First of all, your family, they both want and need to know what your plan is. Everybody should be on the same page. If you pass away untimely or if something happens, when there's big surprises that you've made to your family, it's not always a fun conversation. Also, communicating why you've done something is almost as important as actually doing it. And a lot of times if there's things that are split up a little bit differently, as Bobby had mentioned with Joe, he was putting more land towards his successor child than the other children. But if you explain to the other kids why you're doing things, that can help alleviate a lot of hurt feelings. This is true for estate planning, transition planning, succession, retirement, anything that you're looking at, these communication rules are true. Often what you do is louder than what you actually say. Litigation is on the rise between families. Nobody wants for their family to end up in court over something that they maybe didn't communicate the best way. And then family meetings are always important, but who should attend is gonna be kind of your own situation. Every family is different, and the needs are different based upon that. One last thing, everybody knows of a family member or a neighbor or someone they heard of who had a really good handshake deal with someone or had a really good plan in place, but it wasn't written down. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. If it's not in writing, it basically doesn't exist in the rules we have today. So just make sure that you're good communication and having everything documented.
Don't be the neighbor that everyone's talking about. No one wants that. So we wanted to leave a little time for questions. They do have a microphone, so if you feel comfortable, they'll bring it around to you and we can answer questions. We want to thank you all for coming, and hopefully you found something helpful today as you try to navigate. And if you are Joe and you want to retire sooner rather than later, get with your team and make a plan, or you won't like the bill at the end when Amy tells you how much you owe in tax. Question?
Talking about the one that remains farming when the father dies, or Father Joe and his spouse, then the land that he does not inherit, that can be purchased by the remaining beneficiaries at 50% of the appraised cost. I would think that the appraised cost would be such a variable number based on the price, market price of land today and so on, but I think that would be based on the date of Farmer Joe's death, correct, or his wife. But I see so many variations of appraised value. If you're talking about the market value or the tax value, I know there's quite a difference there, but that would all have to be defined, and how do you feel that should be measured?
Yes, so the question, if you didn't hear, is basically regarding how that buyout amount is determined for the land in our example. So it's at 50% of appraised value. So appraised value is typically what is used in our plans, and then you need to make sure you're reviewing it and keeping in mind what is the appraised value now. That's different than what it was 3 years ago. So in our example, it was $6,500 an acre. It might have been $4,000 an acre. So is that $1 million buyout still feasible? And that's why we're looking at it, continuing to adjust if needed. And you can't just be done after you get it done, because you want to make sure you're keeping up with the appropriate or the values that are changing. So you may say, well, why don't I just put in there it's $1 million buyout? You could, but let's say 20 years pass. Now you open the door for some litigation that says mom and dad thought that $1 million was a lot then, but now that number's $4 million, and I don't think that's what they wanted. Well, there's always that door open. So we like that kind of showing that it stays with the market, but it for what you are trying to accomplish.
One thing we maybe didn't say was estate planning is never really done, right? You get your plan in place, but it should be reviewed, I would say, every year or two, just to make sure nothing has changed in family dynamics, nothing has changed in the children that you're passing things to, or if you have additional successors that you're looking at, or if values change.
Well, one back there, and then I'll come back to you.
My issue is for a child who is inheriting land, how is the tax treatment for that one who inherits the land? What does that look? Are they liable for tax upon receipt of it? Or is it something that's deferred depending on if they sell it?
As of right now, if someone were to pass away and their beneficiaries inherit that land, they would get a step up in basis, so they would get the market value versus the basis that that person, from what they paid for it or however they got it, and then they wouldn't have any tax consequences. If they chose to keep it, they get that value, and if they choose to sell it, that value is probably what they're going to sell it for, so there shouldn't be any gain that would be taxable.
So there's no income tax ramification with that step up in basis. If it is a taxable estate and there's estate tax liability, that's a different story. So I wasn't sure which one you were asking about, but did that answer your question? Okay. Yeah,
Sure.
So as long as your estate doesn't owe tax, where you might have to sell that land to pay the tax, then no income tax liability. Another question?
So who do you have do the assessment on the land?
The question is, who do you have do the assessment on the land? Typically, it's an accredited rural appraiser. We want to make sure that they understand farmland. Probably not someone who's doing all of the home appraisals in let's just pick on Minneapolis, knows a lot about the farmland market here in our area. So we want to make sure it's someone who understands farmland. Usually it's a rural accredited appraiser. And if the people can't agree, sometimes you're having to get a couple appraisals and take the average, but we hope that the heirs, you've explained what you want and that they can get along well enough to trust what that appraisal was.
If you choose to sell equipment piece by piece, who does that appraisal, and can the father sell it at a discounted rate and not have any tax consequence?
It depends upon what the piece of equipment is, you know? I mean, if you're discounting it under that gifting exclusion, so if you have a piece of equipment and you're wanting to gift $18,000 worth of it and they buy it for the rest of it, we don't have to report anything that way. Who do you turn to for appraisal on equipment?
So typically, again, you would want to have an appraisal done before you start doing that. But you can get a pretty good value with the market from, you know, your dealers, whatever. But the IRS would say get an appraisal from someone who does machinery appraisals. If you sell it below the value, so long as it's not more below than the annual exclusion, you don't have to report it. If you sell tractor for $100,000 less, because it's a quad track, you're going to have to report that as a gift and use up some of your lifetime exemption. Any other questions? We'll stick around a little bit if you don't feel comfortable asking your question here. Beautiful day. Go enjoy nice September weather out there.
Our contact information is in the back of the packet too, if you grabbed one of those, if you have a question at a later time. Thank you.
Egg Country offers a wide range of internal growth. If you have a goal in mind and you put your mind to it, your successes can be endless.
There are so many jobs within this company that you can rotate into.
I like challenges. Egg Country gives me challenges.
Yeah, Egg Country is a great place to work. There's plenty of flexibility. You're never tied to your desk. There's a team here that is always there for you.
Yeah, grab your role and run with it, and always be aware of the opportunities because they're in front of you.